Next, let's implement some business logic. While the Servoy platform is based entirely in Java, one does not need to write any Java during the course of development or deployment. Instead, all business logic is implemented using JavaScript. JavaScript was selected because it is an internet standard, easy to learn, and as such, the most widely used scripting language on the planet. JavaScript is far more productive than coding in pure Java, and Servoy provides robust APIs with which to quickly and easily implement your business logic. Now, this logic can be implemented in two scopes: the global scope, which applies to the entire solution, and the form scope, which is specific to a single form. But enough talk. Let's actually create a method and implement our first business logic. What I'd like to do is get rid of the default record navigator that we saw on our form and replace it with one of my own design. I'll start by placing a button on my form. I'm going to use this button to invoke a script that's going to advance the selected record by 1. So first I'm going to select the onAction event property and double click it. Now it's at this point that I could bind a script that I write to this button. And I'm going to start by creating a form method. I'll call my method nextRecord. Now I can navigate to my method by selecting this folder, which will jump right to it, but you'll also notice that as I select my customer's form, the nextRecord method shows up here. I can double click that or right click it and open in Script Editor. Servoy has created an empty JavaScript function, so I'm ready to begin coding. First, it's worth pointing out that Servoy passes in an event object into every method that's triggered by a UI event. This object can be interrogated to find out information about the event, such as when it occurred, on which component it originated, etc. We won't be using this for our example, but it's nice to know that it's there. I'd also like to draw your attention over to the Solution Explorer, because when it comes time to writing code, the Solution Explorer has everything you need. Everything below your active solution node is really your programming API, and it consists of things in your solution, but also additional APIs such as basic JavaScript libraries, the application node to do all things application related, the solution model to dynamically generate solution components such as forms and labels, etc., the database manager node, which does all things database related, some utilities, some form navigation history, some internal security settings, internationalization or IETN for doing multilingual applications, error handling, the Servoy exception object. There's even JS unit for unit testing, and then there's a whole range of plugins, both provided by Servoy and also third-party plugins that you might want to go out on the internet and include as well. And there's a whole API for adding plugins to Servoy, but that's a topic for another day. What we're going to do is we're going to start with our form object and look at its API. There's an object called the Forms Controller, and that's what we'll be using to advance our record index. So I'm going to highlight this commented tag here and remove it, and I'm going to find the method that I want. Now I happen to know that it is setSelectedIndex, so I'll select that method right here. It's really convenient because if you're new to Servoy, you can move the code over and it'll fill it out for you, so you get the syntax right. Or optionally, you can move a commented sample, which includes comments within the code for example usage. And in fact, this example has exactly what we want. You can see that in the first line here, it stores the selected index to a variable, and then it sets the selected index and increments the variable by 1. Finally, as you become more proficient at developing in Servoy, you can take advantage of Code Complete or IntelliSense, and I can begin to type the controller object. And as I type, I can actually find my method and finish my code that way. This Code Complete is available for the entire Servoy API, and also Servoy implements Code Complete on the methods that you write. Let's make a save to our form, and bring up the Debug Client. You can see that the button appears on my form, and as I click it, it scrolls through the records. Switching back to Servoy, I'll quickly copy and paste to create a couple other buttons, and we'll complete our record scroller. We're all ready to go, except for I want to turn off that kind of ugly record scroller and set the navigator property to none. And I'll save the changes to my form. And now when I switch back to the Debug Client, you can see that the navigator is gone and I can use my record scroller to scroll through the records. Now I'd like to add one more feature to my form to provide some visual feedback showing which record we're on. And I'm going to place a label and I'm going to use a feature called merge text in Servoy where I make the label data driven. So I'll double click it and open up the dialog, and I'll begin to type in here, but you can see that to the left I have a bunch of tags that I can insert to make this label data driven. I can choose from the data providers, from related data providers, etc. And there are some standard tags as well. And I'm going to select selected index, and I'll do then max record index, and I'll click OK. Now one final step is to check this property here, display tags, which lets Servoy know to interpret the tags rather than display them literally. So now when I save changes to my form and switch back to the Debug Client, you can see that I'm showing record 39 of 91, and now I can more effectively test my code out. By jumping to the first record, I go to 1, and then I can advance or retreat the record, and I can jump to the last record in the found set. Finally, I'd like to do one more business rule here, and I'd like to take advantage of one of the events on the form. You can see the list of them here, and there's quite a few for on record edit start, stop, on show, on hide, but the one I'm interested in is on record selection, and this gets fired every time the selected record changes. So I'm going to double click that and create a form method to handle that event, and I'll just call it on record selection. Now I'll click the folder here to jump right into the method, and again I'll begin to fill in this empty function that Servoy created. So what I'd like to do is actually enable or disable the record controller buttons that I created based on whether or not we can actually go back or go forward. Now before I write the code here, there's one more step. I'm going to navigate back to my form, and I actually have to give these components some names so that I can refer to them programmatically. So I'll fill out the name property. I'll call this btn last, btn next, btn prev, and finally btn first. So now when I save my form, you can see that under the elements I have those buttons by name. So now when I go back to my method, I can interact with them programmatically. So if I select one of my components here, in this case the btn first, you'll see that it has a programmatic property called enabled. And what I can do is set this to true or false to disable or enable the component. So if I double click that, you can see that it just moved it right into my code, and I can actually assign a Boolean value to it, true or false. But first I'm going to create a variable to describe whether or not I can go to the first record. And in fact, I'm going to call it can go back. So I'm declaring a variable called can go back, and it's going to evaluate to the controller dot get selected index greater than 1. So if the index is greater than 1, then I can go back, otherwise I can't. And then I'll assign that Boolean value to the enabled property of my button. And you can see that as I'm typing, I can actually enter control space to bring up code complete, and that ensures that I don't get any typos. I'm going to copy this whole line and do the btn prev, so that'll take care of my back buttons. And I'll do the same thing, only this time I'll call it can go forward. And in this case, it'll be controller.getSelectedIndex, and it'll be less than controller getMaxRecordIndex. And I'll assign that Boolean value to a couple other enabled properties of my buttons. So we have btn next.enabled, and I'll copy that line and I'll paste it in, and I'll just do the last one, which is the btn last. And so there we go. I finished the code for my on-record selection event. So this gets fired every time the record changes, and my buttons will update their appearance. Let's switch over to the debug client and see how it works. I'm going to click the first record button, and you can see that as I went to record 1, both the first record and the previous record buttons were disabled, but as I go to record 2, they become enabled. And if I scroll all the way to record 91, the last one in the found set, then again these buttons become disabled. Now this is a very simple example, but it's worth pointing out that there are UI events for the forms, but also every component that you can place on a form. So you can trap any one of those events and implement some business logic from them.